Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here on the 5x5 network. Back with another fireside chat here for the evening. Hopefully you guys had a very Merry Christmas. Looks like we are up across the board here finally. Got Twitch aboard. Good to see you guys. Got a few of you over on the YouTube side, a few of you over on the D-Live side. Wait for you guys to pile in here just a little bit. Good to see everybody. Caffeine Addict, D Dusker Who, David F. Good to see you. Let a few more of you guys pile in. A couple of you is over on the Periscope side as well. Got a few things on the mind tonight. We're going to continue on what we covered here prior to Christmas. Out of the Blogmire, the 5-part series, we'll pick up on part 4. Part 5 has not yet graced the feeds. I would expect here in the next day or two before the end of the year that piece will come out. We'll save that for a subsequent fireside chat. And a couple other things concerning our rights and where things are headed in this country. We're going to discuss a few of those things here tonight as well. So, that being said, appreciate you guys tuning in. And we'll just get on with it. And we'll break in between, have a little discussion about things. So sit back, relax, enjoy the fire, gather around, grab your favorite beverage of choice, and we'll go from there. So out of the Blogmire, 2020, the year the church was as sharp as a two-edged marshmallow. Yep, marshmallow, folks. So this is the 4th of 5 end-of-year articles looking at various aspects of our new COVIDian state in 2020. Parts 1, 2, and 3 are here, and here, which we've already covered here on the channel. If you missed any, you can go back on previous firesides, check that out. And says these pieces are also due to be published on the excellent Conservative Woman website from the 27th through the 31st December. So we'll see part 5 in the next couple days. So the article goes like this. It says, it is a curious fact that the Bible contains the phrase, fear not, many times, whereas the word nice is never used, except, of course, in some of the really marshmallowy modern translations. Some websites tell us that we are exhorted not to fear 365 times, which would be lovely for someone making a book titled Round the Year with No Fear. But alas, it is not so. There aren't 365. Nevertheless, however many times the phrase or sentiment is used, it is precisely that number more than the number of times the exhortation to be nice is used. Yet, you'd hardly know it to look at the state of many churches at the moment. There seems to be an overwhelming emphasis on being nice, and I'm using air quotes around that word, which generally means never saying anything provocative or dangerous or which could be seen as being judgmental. Yet, when along came a virus, fear seemed to be in plenteous supply. I must admit to being more than a little stunned by the reaction of many churches this year. Whatever calamities befall us in life, Christians are exhorted to overcome by seeing them as a light momentary affliction, which is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And that, of course, out of 2 Corinthians 4:17. This does not mean never fearing. Rather, it means that we are to overcome that fear through faith. So, in Psalm 91, the psalmist can say, you will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. And in this particular article, they've highlighted the pestilence. And so if you don't know what the pestilence is, I would advise you to look it up. If you have a Bible that happens to have the Strong's concordance in conjunction with that, to where you can actually look up either the Greek or Hebrew version of that word and its use, throughout, I would encourage you to do so. And he says, this is not because he's a stoic, but because he's just said this. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. True belief in the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ is supposed to equip the Christian to overcome fear. Yet, it has seemed to me that the reaction of much of the church to a coronavirus, with an infection fatality rate of around 0.2% to 0.26%, let me repeat that, 0.2 to 0.26%, so less than 1% for you folks who have a little trouble with your maths, has really been no different to that of the non-Christian. What could have been a glorious time for the church to shine, with national leaders exhorting the nation to repent, exhorting people to overcome their fears by embracing the gospel of the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, became a non-event. But this is not the half of it. Fear of the virus has shaped the way many have responded to the most astonishing powers over churches for 8 centuries. You have to go back to 1208 to see such a closure of churches, which was done by a papal interdict. Interestingly enough, on 23rd of March, the same day as lockdown began, which lasted for 6 years. Not quite 6 years this time, but a third of the year no less. And no, the state did not close churches during the Spanish flu. Yet, when a virus of less than a tenth the lethality of Spanish flu came on the scene, and far, far less than this for under 60s, the church largely rolled over. What was most incredible was the lack of crying out to God for deliverance. And there and here it matters not whether people thought the plague had come to town, or that the reaction to the virus was massively disproportionate. The response should have been the same. Much anguished and fervent prayer for deliverance, which is the pattern set out in Scripture, and is how our ancestors would have reacted. I understand there may have been nervousness back in March, when some feared we were about to see a sort of plague coming our way. However, at the very least, the churches could have said to the government, okay, you've said 3 weeks, and we'll hold you to that. But if you cannot come up with an evidence-based justification as to how opening churches and letting healthy people gather together is detrimental, we're going to defy you, and do it anyway. Defiance? Hardly. Not only do the majority of the churches in the country seem to think the state has absolute jurisdiction over the church, and by the way, it doesn't, but they have allowed it to reshape the way they worship, including singing, the covering of faces with bits of cloth, and the ceasing of physical gatherings and physical fellowship. The irony, of course, is that this is done ostensibly in obedience to God. Yet the Bible commands us to worship God together physically, Hebrews 10:25, to cultivate fellowship together physically, Acts 2:42, and to sing loudly. As an example, Psalm 47:1. Many churches have kidded themselves that this can all be done remotely, over Zoom. Well, no. If God says we are to gather physically together, sing together, and have close fellowship together, it's very likely that if these things are not done for months on end, you're going to find churches emptying and fraying at the seams. Furthermore, many of the things which have been foisted on us by the state diktat have amazingly been turned into expressions of how we are to love our neighbor. Take masks. Back in March, in the state told us repeatedly not to wear them. Then in July, when the epidemic was over, they told us to wear them. And many in the church not only went along with this unscientific drivel, but the likes of the Archbishop of Canterbury turned it into an expression of how we are to love one another. Before 2020, the idea that a state mandate could be connected with Christian love would have seemed faintly absurd. But it seems the government has now acquired the power of love, to add to its many other astonishing powers. 2020 has exposed a feebleness and a hollowness at the heart of many churches, as well as a lack of proper theological framework with which to look at the whole COVID situation and frame a response to it. Instead, many churches have let the likes of Johnson, Hancock, Whitty, and Valance do their thinking for them, implementing whatever harebrained schemes these people come up with to perpetuate the fear and hysteria which they have stoked up all year long. I suspect that many of those same churches will be wringing their hands next year as the policies they failed to challenge throughout the year come home to roost, and we see untold misery coming upon millions, with the poorest suffering most. The result of all this is that the church is being decimated, and the watching world has not exactly been given a wonderful lesson about how faith in the King of Kings and Lord of Lords can help us become more than conquerors. If the church is to recover from this, which I have no doubt it will in time, a lot of very serious questions need to be asked, followed by repentance, followed by a massive work of reformation. The feebleness must go. The hollowness must go. The niceness must go. The paltry theology must go. And the marshmallow must go. Now, none of what I've said above is nice. Then again, it wasn't meant to be. But it was necessary. So, I'll just open up the night with the probably most controversial, I suppose, of the articles I have in hand. But I think he's absolutely spot on. I do wholeheartedly agree that the fact that there has been a lack of a scientific response by the church at large. Doesn't matter what church you go to, what branch you go to, doesn't matter at the end of the day. Yes, you've seen some churches take the fight back by way of lawsuits and whatnot. But our authority is not government, folks. Our authority is the Lord above, period. That's it. And the very fact that they think that they have to abdicate and go through a judicial system to take the fight back to these folks is inherently wrong, in my opinion. And the old phrase that I remember hearing so often prior to 2017, having listened to folks like Alex Jones, many a show, is that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Does the church even recognize what tyranny is at this point? Or are they just going to continue to go along with it? Interesting question, right? How has your church responded for those that go to your respective churches? Good evening, El Jefe. Good to see you in-house. Motivacio para todos. How are things down in Brazil? Joe Gallo, good to see you. Kelly Young. So, in any case, let's continue on with the next one that I have in stock for the evening. Again, if you're just joining, got a handful of articles. I tend to save some of those that give us pause and cause us to think a little bit for the whole fireside chats. This one comes out of Advancing Time, Bruce Wild's blog spot. It says, before long, they may take away your right to drive. Think about that for a second. Look at how fast technology is developing. For those that follow Tesla and Elon Musk and the fact that BMW and Ford and a number of these corporations are pushing us toward electric vehicles. Who decided that electric vehicles were the way to go? Who says that the internal combustion engine is bad? Oh, I see. Perhaps there might be an agenda at play, right? Agenda 2030? Agenda 21 revisited? Green New Deal? Yeah. All of which lead toward the same thing, control. You know, I can recall watching cartoons back in the day. For a guy of my age, it's probably going to date myself a little bit, of watching the Jetsons. And of course, at that time, they were obviously flying around in little spaceships, whatever the heck you want to call them, thinking, boy, I wonder if we'll ever be in a position where, we won't be driving on roads, but perhaps be bopping around in the skies, having our own personal saucers, if you will. Why are we not further along technologically than just driving on the road? And now we're going to say, and governments are going to foist upon us, that the electric vehicle is the way to go? Alright, well, let's dig into this article a little bit. Before long, they may take away your right to drive. Well, with all the things that are going on, would it surprise you that before long the government may take away your right to drive? While this may sound absurd, please bear with me. For years in my state, a question that is on every driver's test is driving a right or a privilege? Of course, the answer is, it is a privilege. If you ask the Department of Motor Vehicles in your state, expect them to agree. Driving isn't something just anyone can do. Not legally, anyway. It's a privilege that's earned by showing you have the skills and knowledge to drive safely. And I want you to hang on this word drive, because I'm going to come back to that word at the very end here. And there's a reason for that, and it also hinges upon what he's describing here as a right or a privilege. So bear with me. The point they want to make it clear is that, driving is a privilege and something they can take away from you. To most Americans who have grown up with an automobile, the idea may sound foreign or strange, but within a few years only a small percentage of us may be allowed to own or operate a vehicle. Now, I'm not predicting this will happen overnight, but it is something that is likely to unfold over 3 to 7 years as big tech slowly tightens the screws and asserts more control over our lives. After only a few months of living in a COVID-19 world, it has become clear those in charge can change the rules in a blink of an eye. The idea the world is moving in the direction of removing this so-called privilege started to emerge just a few years ago. Now, several trends are rapidly coming together, which makes this much more probable. A few are listed below. Self-driving vehicle technology is rapidly improving. People are becoming more comfortable with the idea of car sharing. Many people cannot afford an automobile. Central banks are rapidly moving into social engineering and fighting climate change. And several companies have floated the idea of developing fleets of robo-taxis. Just the other day, Apple threw its hat into the ring when it announced its intention to move forward with developing self-driving car technology. And I guess I'll pause right there quick to highlight the fact that so far, Tesla has not done very well in that regard. For what I follow day in, day out, just about weekly, if not a couple times a week, I come across an article where a Tesla has smacked into something. And the pilot, sitting there, reading a paper, asleep, playing on their iPad or whatever, obviously hands not on the wheel, not paying attention. The car erred in it with its algorithms and smacked into something, and chances are the occupant likely died. So we've got a little ways to go, but yet they're advancing. According to Reuters, Apple is targeting 2024 to produce a passenger vehicle. Make no mistake, this has the potential to derail Elon Musk's plan for Tesla to put out 1 million robo-taxis. This places Apple in the position of competing with others with major self-driving projects, including Tesla and Google/Alphabet's Waymo project, which stands for a new way forward in mobility. Adding to the validity that Apple is serious about moving in this direction, Reuters also reported Apple's cars might include sensors and a new monocell-designed battery that has been developed internally at Apple. Such a battery could be a much-needed breakthrough in battery technology. The lack of better batteries is one of the biggest problems currently facing the EV industry. A new battery design that could radically reduce battery cost and increase a vehicle's range. A better battery has been seen as the holy grail of the EV industry. As to how they might remove your driving privileges, the answer is slowly at first, then rapidly after they reach a certain point. Simply by raising the cost of owning and operating a vehicle, they can dent the number of people desiring to drive. This can be done by raising the price and requirements to get and maintain a driver's license, or hiking fees and excise taxes on various types of vehicles. Making the claim this new technology is much safer, we might see insurance rates for individuals skyrocket compared to those paid for autonomous vehicles. They could also ban human-operated vehicles from entering certain areas. Another way to choke off our desire to own an operated vehicle is to sever our ability to get fuel or parts by making them either more expensive or impossible to get. One or all of these tools would substantially reduce the desire to drive for many people. Remember, this is about those in power being able to assert their power over the masses. This can be tied to a narrative that is being done for the greater good and the claim it will massively reduce climate change by cutting waste and making society more efficient. While some of you may have a difficult time imagining a world in which you would be totally dependent on a self-driving vehicle to get around, the writing is already on the wall. Even at the early stage of their development, some car makers are already suggesting or claiming that self-driving vehicles will reduce accidents to nearly zero and save thousands of lives each year. The problem is, many people enjoy driving and the freedom that comes with it. Some of us have absolutely no desire to own a self-driving car. I guess I seem to recall the old ads of old, I guess, perhaps, what was it, back in the 50s and 60s? See the USA in my Chevrolet? In the world I have described, only the rich and powerful would have a car and be granted the privilege to drive them. For those of you that doubt this could happen, or be the goal of our new masters, I remind you, few people would have ever predicted many of the Orwellian tactics governments across the world have used to squelch this pandemic that has killed far fewer people than originally predicted. Very, very interesting, right? Can you think of a situation where none of us would be able to drive? We'd have self-driving automated vehicles, all EV. And again, the key word here is drive. Why do I highlight drive? Well, unfortunately, and what we need to wise up to is the duality and meaning of many of these words. Right? You know, the common folk typically think of words in a Merriam-Webster-esque type dictionary fashion. However, many of you probably don't realize that if something like this were to ever make it into court, this has perhaps entirely different meanings or different contexts in the way these words can be interpreted. For their benefit, of course, not yours. Come on now. And that's why dictionaries like Black's Law Dictionary exists. So what does drive mean? Well, drive just so happens to mean that whoever is piloting the automobile is acting in commerce. A driver's license, a privilege, acting in commerce. So every time you get behind the wheel, are you acting in commerce? No. Don't think so. But here's how you circumvent that. We have a right to travel. That can't be taken away. A driver's license, yes, is a privilege, but a right to travel, regardless of what means or ways you opt to get around from point A to B, cannot be taken away. A right to travel. So, yes, we are going to have to combat these in any way, shape, and form that we can in the coming years. In the event they do try to pull some shenanigans like this, continue to raise the prices of things to make it unaffordable for us to get around on our own. Continuing on. Another interesting article out of the Burning Platform. Jim Quinn had this to say today. It says, are we really going to build back better after a dark winter? Who have we heard dark winter spewed from in the past several weeks? None other than creepy Uncle Joe. Interesting. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, the shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going, because they were holding on to something. That there is some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. J.R.R. Tolkien quote. With all the talk about dark winters from Biden, Harris, Fauci, tyrannical Democrat governors, pandemic hysteria, medical quote-unquote experts, and the corporate media paid to propagate the vital narrative, my mind was naturally drawn to the words of J.R.R. Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings trilogy. It is a story of good versus evil, with a foreboding mood of darkness and doom. To those of us of a conspiratorial nature, according to those who conspired to overthrow a duly elected president for 4 years and are currently conspiring to steal the presidency through blatant election rigging and mail-in ballot fraud, we believe the darkness engulfing our nation has been initiated by the billionaire globalist evildoers marshaling dark forces in their mortar on the Potomac. The globalist elites, and I hate even using the word elites. Better word is probably parasites, because that's exactly what they are. They're parasites. Along with the deep state and social media tyrants of Silicon Valley, are rich, influential, and arrogant. They have stepped out from the shadows and are now blatantly flaunting their capture of our government, electoral systems, financial systems, mainstream media, social media, and medical complex. They have gauged the intellectual, ethical, and mathematical aptitude of the masses and found them wanting. They have no fear of significant pushback as they commit treason by stealing a presidential election, trashing the Constitution, destroying small business owners, impoverishing what remains of the middle class, and imposing totalitarian restrictions upon a compliant, obedient populace. A nation once populated by independent-minded, self-reliant frontiersmen has rotted from within, as the country is now populated by millions of weak-minded, submissive, docile sheep, allowing themselves to be bullied and propagandized into paralysis, while texting, tweeting, and Facebooking their every mindless thought to their followers. Unless the Trump forces can prove fraud on a multi-state basis, or are willing to take the drastic step of utilizing the September 12, 2018 executive order regarding foreign interference in elections as justification for using the Insurrection Act and overturning the fraudulent outcome of the election, the end of the nation as we know it will have arrived. Losing the 2 Senate runoff elections in Georgia would greatly accelerate the decline. If more Americans had the ability and/or desire to think critically, rather than choosing to be willfully ignorant and entranced by their electronic gadgets, they would understand how they are being manipulated and played by global elites, corporate fascists, billionaire totalitarians, and a corporate media using a common narrative as propaganda to mold their minds and play upon their emotions. It is not a coincidence when common phrases and narratives are propagated by those pulling the strings behind the scenes of this Potemkin village of villainy. It has never been more apparent than during this year of pandemic hysteria. Phrases like dark winter, lockdown, build back better, we are all in this together, and we're not, flatten the curve, social distancing, stop the spread, self-quarantine, contact tracing, new normal, remote learning, Black Lives Matter, and of course, the Great Reset, have been introduced into our vocabulary as a means of controlling, dehumanizing, and invoking fear among the population. Biden's handlers have had him fear-mongering with the dark winter jargon since October, as her plan was to not pass a relief bill for poverty-stricken, unemployed workers and small businesses, ramp up testing to extraordinary levels using a PCR test guaranteed to produce millions of false positives, and classify the deaths of thousands of very old people as COVID deaths, no matter what they really died from, all to seize power over the government. The propaganda of dark winter is designed to scare the population into submitting to lockdowns, canceling Thanksgiving and Christmas, begging for the big pharma vaccines, and allowing totalitarian mandates from Washington, D.C., state capitals, and localities to be executed without resistance. With the unceasing support of left-wing media outlets, the use of dire warnings by your overlords isn't based upon facts, but a purposeful effort to appeal to the emotions of the non-critical thinking masses. And the article lists out a whole bunch of headlines, stringing all the way back to, about October 22nd, Biden warns of dark winter in America out of Politico all the way to and through, looks to be about December 4th. Biden urges Congress to act on economy and COVID with dark winter. So yes, the terminology has been used openly many a time. When doing a search regarding the dark winter, you find a conspiracy theorist bonanza. Operation Dark Winter was the code name for a bioterrorist simulation conducted in June 2001 by Johns Hopkins, high-level government officials, and the media regarding a widespread smallpox attack scenario. The similarities to the release of a virus from a Chinese bioweapon lab in Wuhan are a little eerie. The findings from this simulation should be familiar to anyone who has been paying attention for the last 10 months. Dark Winter outlined the possible breakdown in essential institutions, resulting in a loss of confidence in government, followed by civil disorder, and a violation of democratic processes by authorities attempting to restore order. Shortages of vaccines and other drugs affected the response available to contain the epidemic, as well as the ability of political leaders to offer reassurance to the American people. State government leaders wanted to invoke mandatory quarantining and border control. The lack of coordinated healthcare response exacerbated the fear of the population and overwhelmed the capacity in hospitals. The most pertinent finding from the simulation was information management would be the critical element in manipulating the crisis. They would need to manage the narrative to convince the population lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations, and disease containment measures were good for society. And most importantly, the government knew what was best. It seems those who believe they know what is best for the world, Gates, Soros, Schwab, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Dorsey, Obama, Clinton, along with other deep state operatives, have put these lessons to good use. They understand the power of Bernays' propaganda techniques, combined with modern-day technological algorithms and psychological manipulation, along with population dumbed down by decades of government school indoctrination, where they were taught to feel rather than think. They know if they can successfully market their desired narrative through plugging paid quote-unquote expert opinions, unceasing mainstream media messaging, social media promotion of the narrative, and suppression of counter-narratives through censorship, and politicians mouthing what they are told to regurgitate by their puppeteer controllers, they will achieve their objectives. You can even use their own technology to prove their duplicitousness and duplicitous intentions. Google Trends reveals the phrase "dark winter" was virtually non-existent until October 2020. The deep state public relations leeches running Biden's campaign did some psychological testing on potential propaganda victims and found having Biden, his minions, and co-conspiratorial media utter this phrase thousands of times per day would invoke enough fear to convince the plebes to stay locked down, masked up, and pleading for the vaccine. The message was designed to scare enough people into voting for Biden, that the election rigging wouldn't seem as blatant as it became. The dark winter narrative peaked in the weeks following the election, but is now being revived as part of the big government/big pharma marketing campaign to shame and fear the ignorant masses into compliantly getting injected with an experimental big pharma vaccine with unknown long-term effects. So, what is the ultimate purpose of this propaganda campaign? There are no coincidences when it comes to the narrative being utilized to manipulate the minds of the masses during this deliberately overhyped pandemic. Is the virus real? Based on personal anecdotes of numerous people who have had this China flu, it most certainly makes some people extremely sick and contributes to the deaths of some people. Most people barely notice any symptoms. People less than 70 years old and in relatively good health have a 99.7% chance of not dying from this flu. Even those over 70 have a 94.6% chance of surviving if they get this flu. This flu contributes to the deaths of the very old and very sick, probably shortening their lives by months, not years. Maybe that is why the study done by a Dr. at Johns Hopkins showing no excess mortality in the U.S. during 2020 needed to be scrubbed, deleted, and memory holed. It revealed the pandemic hysteria narrative to be false. Amazingly, reported flu cases are down 98%, with no deaths, and deaths from heart disease and other respiratory ailments have plummeted. What a coincidence! Based on the positivity rate from the mass testing, it appears 10% of the population has had or has this flu. There have been 326,000 deaths classified as COVID since March. We know this is a grossly exaggerated number because the medical industrial complex is highly compensated by the government with your money to classify death as COVID. Actual data shows only 6% of the total deaths are from COVID alone. Also, for those incapable of critical thinking, a case is not a sickness. Most people testing positive due to faulty PCR tests don't know they even have this dreadful disease. And now that everyone entering a hospital for a procedure gets tested, a positive test means they are classified as a COVID hospitalization. The quote-unquote masking saves lives narrative is a complete and utter joke, as proved by any factual analysis, which will be immediately suppressed by Facebook, Twitter, and Google. How many TikTok nurse dance routines does it take for people to realize the quote-unquote hospitals at capacity narrative is bullshit? We also know for a fact over 40% of all deaths have occurred in long-term care facilities, thanks to best-selling author on leadership and Emmy Award winner Andrew Cuomo and his fellow left-wing totalitarian governors Newsom, Wolf, Murphy, and Whitmer. As the election approached, the daily testing was ramped from 1 million to over 2 million because the quote-unquote resistance needed cases to surge and make it appear the situation was getting dramatically worse to help steal the election. All part of the plan, along with the necessity of mass mail and ballot voting because it was too dangerous to stand in line at polling places, but perfectly safe to be in massive lines at Walmart, Target, and Costco. And now, we have the full press life-saving vaccine marketing campaign on par with the rollout of version 6,875 of the Apple iPhone, designed to enrich Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and the other dozen big pharma mega corporations and their billionaire benefactors. The televised vaccine injections by politicians, Hollywood actors, Fauci, and other quote-unquote important people are broadcasted breathlessly by the vacuous, bimbo, and brainless male model talking heads on CNN, MSNBC, and the other propaganda media to convince the ignorant masses they need to blindly comply to save themselves from a horrible disease with a 99.7% survival rate. The concerted effort to scorn, ridicule, censor, and disallow any discussion about the tremendous effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine plus zinc plus Z-Pak in curing this virus is another example of the Big Pharma Profits mantra as the dominant theme. This perfectly safe and effective treatment only costs a few bucks and doesn't enrich the pandemia crowd, so it had to be squashed. How many people died because politicians banned this treatment until after the election? Ivermectin, generally used to treat parasite infestations, has also proven to be a highly effective in treating COVID-19. But you will never hear Fauci or a MSM talking head admit this is true. There are billions to be made. And if cases begin to peak, just announce a new quote-unquote mutant strain with no proof or data, and the fearful masses will again beg the government to keep them locked down. There is a population to control and reduce. They expect you to believe the 95% vaccine success rate after 9 months, when they haven't achieved a 40% success rate with the annual flu after decades. And they absolutely know the long-term effects of a product they just produced with far less testing than has been done to test the safety of previous vaccines. 5 years from now, when negative impacts begin to reveal themselves, they will say, "How could we have known?" And since the mega corporation pharma companies have been granted immunity from liability for their negligence, their hundreds of billions in profits will be safe. How long before Fauci is sitting on the boards of Pfizer and Moderna, collecting six-figure board fees? It is fascinating how the World Health Organization suddenly changed their definition of herd immunity on their website to say that it can only be achieved through vaccinations, which is categorically untrue. When you realize the breadth of this conspiracy of billionaire oligarchs, the UN, World Health Organization, CDC, corrupt politicians, Big Pharma, the entire medical complex, corporate media, and feckless bureaucrats to plunder the wealth of the masses and implement their command and control agenda, you might understand Mencken's rage. In part 2 of this article, I'll lay out Klaus Schwab's master plan to reset the world in the warped vision of the globalist elites. In part 3, I will use the wisdom of J.R.R. Tolkien to try and map a path through these dark times. And so I will bring those forward in subsequent fireside chats as well, just as we'll wrap up the 5-part series I led off the show with here this evening. But to highlight a quip here, it says, there comes a time in every man's life when he's consumed by the desire to spit on his palms, hoist the black flag, and start cutting throats. Are we there yet? The corrupt establishment will do anything to suppress sites like the Burning Platformer from revealing the truth. The corporate media does this by demonetizing sites like mine, by blackballing the site from advertising revenue. If you get value from this site, please keep it running with a donation. And of course, you can donate to Jim Quinn over at the Burning Platform blog. So, yes, Terry Lashley says HCQ factory just got burned. Yes, we just saw that in recent days over in Taiwan. And I'm sure that is just a mere coincidence that happened on the back of what just happened around this country on Christmas Day in Nashville. And perhaps even up to places up in New York where, it just so happens, places like City Blueprints, certain things that have to do with elections or things like that. I'm sure it is all just a crazy coincidence. Right? When will we learn? When will the masses awake? Are we going to see it play out on January 6th in D.C.? All right. Next article. Americans and their foreign entanglements. This article out of Reason says nothing in U.S. history suggests that ordinary Americans are isolationists, but nothing suggests they've embraced international adventurism either. And I think our forefathers warned us a little bit about this. If you've paid any attention to some of the many a Saturday night spent going through the Federalist Papers, you know that our forefathers were extremely concerned about foreign entanglements. So this article highlights Isolationism, a history of America's efforts to shield itself from the world. It's a book by Charles A. Kupchan, Oxford University Press, about 464 pages. About $30. I'm sure you can find that over at Amazon. But this is going to be a quip out of that book. It says, "It is not unusual for intellectuals who study U.S. history to conflate the views of political leaders with those of all Americans. This is how Charles A. Kupchan, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and former member of the National Security Council, convinces himself in Isolationism, a history of America's efforts to shield itself from the world, that from the founding until the Second World War, Americans were dangerously, consistently, and almost universally opposed to foreign interventions, with the notable departures of the Spanish-American War of 1898, the subsequent decades-long occupation of the Philippines, and U.S. entry into the killing fields of the First World War. Since the intervention against the Axis in the 1940s, Kupchan argues that Americans have vacillated between a reluctance to intervene outside the national borders and a desire to remake the world in their image. But throughout our history, he maintains, isolationism has remained Americans' abiding attitude toward foreign relations. Until the 1930s, no polls measured U.S. attitudes on the subject, leaving us little information about the foreign policy views of Americans who did not hold public office. But we know quite a bit about the beliefs among American presidents, members of Congress, and political intellectuals from all periods of U.S. history. Among this class, the record shows a remarkably consistent commitment to forging, expanding, and maintaining a worldwide American empire. Like many historians, Kupchan repeats the standard claim that George Washington's famous warning against foreign entanglements represented the views of the founders and was followed by American leaders until the mid-20th century. In fact, the Founding Fathers were aggressive, unapologetic imperialists who fantasized about the creation of a global America. Long before he entered politics, John Adams developed a theory of historical change that predicted America would become the next Rome. He wrote to a friend in 1755 that the great seat of empire had been transferred from Rome to Britain and would likely move into America. The new country would obtain the mastery of the seas, and the united force of all Europe will not be able to subdue us. Like Adams, Benjamin Franklin dreamed of an infinitely expansive American empire. In 1751, he provided a rationale derived from John Locke's theory that property belongs to those who mix their labor with nature, for conquering and occupying all the land held by indigenous people in North America. Industrious Anglo-Saxons, who Franklin expressly preferred as the inhabitants of the new republic, were to replace the Indians with a new empire. Hence, the prince that acquires new territory, if he finds it vacant or removes the natives to give his own people room, the legislator that makes effectual laws for promoting of trade, increasing employment, improving land by more or better tillage, providing more food by fisheries, securing property, and the man that invents new trades, arts, or manufactures, or new improvements in husbandry may be properly called fathers of their nation. As President George Washington, whose heroes included Caesar and Alexander the Great, allowed Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson to push for a buildup of the Navy and the creation of a Marine Corps, as well as for continued expansion westward across North America. Jefferson called for sending troops and warships to attack pirate ships operating from the northern African Barbary states that had captured and plundered American commercial vessels. Jefferson's rival, Alexander Hamilton, agreed that the United States was the embryo of a great empire, even predicting that the U.S. would one day hold overseas colonies. Within days of Jefferson's inauguration in 1801, 4 U.S. warships set sail for Tripoli. Throughout his first term, American ships patrolled the Mediterranean, blockading the ports of several North African states and sinking or capturing Barbary pirate corsairs and Tripolitan ships. By the summer of 1804, virtually the entire U.S. Navy was deployed to the region, 23 war vessels in all, including a squadron of gunships that remained anchored in the harbor of Tripoli, bombarding the city with impunity. The next year, Jefferson sent ashore a fighting force of Marines and mercenaries who besieged the Pasha's palace and replaced him with his brother, who had sworn to cooperate with the U.S. In 1801, Jefferson told James Monroe of his vision for a totalizing and universal Americanism, calling it impossible not to look forward to distant times, when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern, continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar forms, and by similar laws. The United States established an extensive network of formal representatives in the Mediterranean, with American consuls and Navy personnel stationed in more than a dozen cities. Jefferson also negotiated the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which brought a swath of 828,000 square miles of land, with all the diverse peoples living on it, into the United States. In an instant, the country's territory had doubled. Kupchan not only ignores the founder's messianic globalism, but claims that isolationism held sway throughout the 19th century. He overlooks the exceptionally aggressive ideas of Abraham Lincoln, who shared the founder's interpretation of natural rights as a doctrine of imperial obligation. As the historian John Patrick Diggins has put it, Lincoln treated the claim all men are created equal as a moral imperative rather than as a scientific postulate. The conquest, occupation, and reconstruction of the defeated Confederate states followed this line of thinking. For Kupchan, the first notable departure from isolationist thought was the Spanish-American War. He acknowledged that the term isolationist was coined during this period by the war's proponents as a slur against anti-imperialists. It implied that those who opposed the conquest and colonization of foreign lands and the march of American civilization were blinkered, anti-modern curmudgeons. Kupchan's second departure was Woodrow Wilson's campaign to send hundreds of thousands of young Americans to fight and die in Europe. After that, Kupchan says, the U.S. entered a period of naive abdication of the duty to protect the world from Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Leaving aside questions about whether either regime possessed the desire or ability to expand beyond its geographical region, we know that most ordinary Americans during the notorious isolationist era of the 1920s and 1930s were interested in shielding themselves from war, not the world. Opinion polls conducted in the 1930s did show that a majority of Americans opposed military inventions abroad. But when they were allowed, Americans voted overwhelmingly with their wallets and their feet for engagement with the world through travel and trade. Despite tariffs on a range of foreign goods, the total value of merchandise imports into the U.S. rose steadily through the 1920s. The number of U.S. visitors to Europe jumped from roughly 15,000 in 1912 to 251,000 in 1929. That same year, 8,500 Americans traveled to Japan, more than ever before. After the devastating Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was repealed in 1934, imports rose rapidly, despite the global depression. Kupchan concedes that in the period between the end of the Second World War and the rise of Donald Trump, isolationism became an epithet, as the United States established itself as the most powerful global empire in human history. Trump questioned wars of choice, regime changes, nation building, and the very idea that America is obliged to oversee the world, though he didn't follow through on any of these ideas. American troops still remain in Afghanistan and Iraq, and none of the 800 military bases in foreign countries that he inherited has been closed. Nonetheless, Kupchan wrote this book to counter what he sees as a Trumpian threat to the internationalist order. Kupchan believes he's offering a warning. He fears that an overly aggressive set of foreign policies has pushed ordinary Americans and some in the political class to follow Trump in abandoning America's role as the world's hegemon. Kupchan wants the U.S. to reduce much of its military presence in the Middle East, where he considers the policies of recent presidents to be acts of overreach. But he wants to remain the dominant power in Europe and globally. A little bit of isolationism, judiciously applied, will save American internationalism. An informed, cautious, and selective pullback is far preferable to a precipitous retreat. Nothing in U.S. history suggests that ordinary Americans are isolationists, but nothing suggests they've embraced international adventurism either. The fact that the federal government needed to rely on conscription to fight each other's major war from the Civil War to Vietnam, and is now relying on aerial bombing and small special forces operations rather than drafted soldiers to do most of its killing in foreign lands, suggests that it is only the political class that stands between us and a new, unplanned, and ungoverned world order. Interesting. Very interesting take, right? Again, our forefathers warned. The author of this article, over reason, Thaddeus Russell, must have done a little digging and found out where some of our founders' ambitions really lied. Maybe right, I don't know. But nonetheless, kind of a pick apart of the book Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Again, a book by Charles A. Kupchan, Kupchan. About $30 you can pick that up, but I thought it was an interesting article. Obviously, if you look at isolationism or patriotism or whatever form, fashion you wish to call it, very interesting take, right? Let's see here. Last but not least for the evening, Another interesting read out of the 10th Amendment Center. Still going back to our founding fathers, a Christmas gift from James Madison, the Virginia Resolutions of 1798. Article goes back a couple years, December 21st of 2018. Goes a little something like this. Resolutions drafted by James Madison and passed by Virginia on December 21st and 24th, 1798, answer a timeless question. What do we do when the federal government oversteps its constitutional bounds? To reiterate, what do we do when the federal government oversteps its constitutional bounds? Kind of in the same sort of predicament we find ourselves at right now, right? All too often, we simply ignore unconstitutional federal overreach. But James Madison had other ideas. The man known as the father of the Constitution insisted states are, quote, duty-bound to interpose, end quote, and arrest, quote, the progress of the evil, end quote. Madison made this emphatic statement in the Virginia Resolutions of 1798, a document he drafted in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Within a decade of the ratification of the Constitution, the federal government was already testing the limits of its authority. During the summer of 1798, Congress passed and President John Adams signed into law 4 acts together known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. With winds of war blowing across the Atlantic, the Federalist Party majority wrote the laws to prevent seditious acts from weakening the U.S. government. Federalists utilized fear of the French to stir up support for these draconian laws, expanding federal power, concentrating authority in the executive branch, and severely restricting freedom of speech. Sounds very, very similar to what we see playing out here today, yes? 2 of the Alien Acts gave the President the power to declare foreign U.S. residents an enemy, lock them up, and deport them. These acts vested judicial authority in the executive branch and obliterated due process. The Sedition Act essentially outlawed criticizing the federal government, a clear violation of the First Amendment. Recognizing the grave danger these acts posed to the basic constitutional structure, Thomas Jefferson and Madison drafted resolutions that were passed by the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures in November and December 1798, respectively. The Principles of 98 formalized the principles of nullification as the rightful remedy when the federal government oversteps its authority. After Governor Garrard signed the Kentucky resolutions on November 16th, Jefferson sent a draft to Madison, writing, "I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, so as to hold to the ground in future, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent." Madison did just that, drafting his own resolutions for introduction in the Virginia legislature. The Virginia Resolutions of 1798 declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. Madison also asserted that the states had an obligation to act against egregious federal exercises of undelegated power. That this assembly doth explicitly and peremptorily declare that it views the powers of the federal government as resulting from the compact to which the states are parties, as limited by the plain sense and intention of the instrument constituting the compact, as no further valid that they are authorized by the grants enumerated in that compact, and that in the case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. Madison gave his draft of the Virginia resolutions to Wilson Carey Nicholas, who showed them to Jefferson. In a letter dated November 29, 1798, Jefferson recommended adding more emphatic language and declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. The more I have reflected on the phrase in the paper you showed me, the more strongly I think it should be altered. Suppose you were to, instead of the invitation to cooperate in the annulment of the acts, to make it an invitation to concur with this Commonwealth in declaring, as it does hereby declare, that the said acts are, and were ab initio, null, void, and of no force or effect. I should like it better. Health, happiness, and adieu. Nicholas added words declaring that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, not law, but utterly null, void, and of no force or effect. John Taylor of Caroline introduced Madison's resolutions with Nicholas' addition on December 10, 1798. He described the resolutions as a rejection of the false choice between timidity and civil war. Taylor argued that state nullification provided an alternative to popular nullification. In other words, outright armed rebellion. In legislative debates, he argued that the will of the people was better expressed through organized bodies dependent on that will than by tumultuous meetings, that thus the preservation of peace and good order would be more secure. In the course of the debate, Jefferson's suggested wording was removed. During the period following passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, there was talk of outright revolution. Both the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures went to great pains to strike a balance between a hard line and moderation. They wanted to make their point, but they did not want to spark violence. Removing Jefferson's wording did not change the substance of the resolutions. In fact, declaring a law unconstitutional, as the final draft of the resolutions did, was essentially the same thing as calling it null, void, and of no effect. Alexander Hamilton inferred this distinction during the New York ratification debate. The acts of the United States, therefore, will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the general government, but the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere, and when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme or binding. The Virginia House of Delegates passed the resolutions on December 21, 1798, by a vote of 100 to 63. The Senate followed suit on December 24th by a 14 to 3 margin. Taken together, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions lay out the principles of nullification, but they did not actually nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. These non-binding resolutions merely made the case and set the stage for further action. Correspondence between Jefferson and Madison indicates they didn't plan to stop with the resolutions. They hoped to use them as a springboard for state action against the unconstitutional Alien and Sedition Acts. Very, very interesting, right? Alien and Sedition Acts, constitutional or not, laid the framework, put it in the state's hands. However, what happens now? At a time where we have seen the states conspire against one another, the fact that the Supreme Court, the sole arbiter of the land, is to carry out any discrepancies, any issues between states was turned away. Texas and 18 other states against 4 or 5. So can we rely upon the states at this point to do their due diligence? Are we going to see those who wish to ascribe to the Constitution and abide under it take action? Don't know. Don't know. David F. says Insurrection Act happens next. Yes, but no. I would sincerely hope that people do not wish that the Insurrection Act is instituted, to where we do see standing armies across this land, because it plays right into their hands, much the same way that they have always thought that they would try and go against POTUS, for the simple fact that he'll be seen as a dictator who probably won't relinquish power, because again, this plays right into their hands with the Transition Integrity Project bit that they put forward several months before the election. They wargamed this out. What happens if Biden wins, POTUS doesn't leave? What happens if Trump wins, Biden doesn't concede? All these wargame scenarios, right? It plays right into their hands. So, what is the way out of this? Do we think it's going to be through the courts? I don't think so. I think Q has given us ample opportunity to go back on the post from the very early days and say that the military is the only way. However, how does one institute the Insurrection Act without fully bringing aboard the military to get the job done? If the judicial system is corrupt, if the states are corrupt, if your local boards of elections are corrupt, all the way down to the local level, who can we rely upon? Are we going to see everything go through UCMJ? It's tough to say. So lots to consider here this evening. Just some things I'm thinking about. Hopefully it rattles your cage a little bit, cause you to think, give pause. I'm sure we'll have a few more of these in the coming days. But we're in kind of a lull, right? We're watching things play out across the states. We're watching the corruption continue to play out. The Mockingbird media, social media. Everybody toe the line and say, no evidence of corruption, no evidence of corruption. As if the old Goebbels tactic of if you repeat a lie long enough, people will come to believe it. Not gonna stand this time. Too many of us are well aware and awake. We shall not let it stand. So that's what I depart with you this evening. UCMJ, yes. Military Justice, Terry Lashley. In other words, Gitmo. Oh, let's see here. What else is on you guys' mind here this evening? Yeah, take care of UTD Skier. Good to have you aboard. Oath of office means nothing to them? Of course not. That's just a license to steal. People don't go to get in Congress to do the will of the people. They do it to enrich themselves by the lavish lobbyists that sit on K Street. It's the only way that happens. One does not come out millionaires and billionaires by $100,000 a year jobs. It's all about the Benjamins to these folks. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve both God and Mammon. And these guys are about to find out the hard way what happens when God's justice takes place. And it's coming. So keep the faith, folks. We're in for one hell of a ride here in the coming days. And I look forward to January 6th. I really do. For Ulysses S. Grant's statement. I think we've seen Sidney Powell tweet out the meme as well. It's a day we get to find out who the traitors versus patriots really are. And take note, folks. Keep your pen and paper handy. Alright, folks. Well, I appreciate you guys tuning in here for this evening. Now into the wee morning hours of the 29th here. If I don't hear from you here soon, we will have our regular Wednesday show here on the 30th now. We'll be back for that. And again, if you're not tuned into that, we'll do that about 3 o'clock Eastern Time on Wednesday. If we're not here sooner. So take care. God bless. Have a blessed new year. Keep your head on a swivel. And we'll see you back real soon. Take care, everybody.